If you found your way here tonight, whether you're already tucked in, whether the lights are low and the world outside has finally gone quiet, or whether you're somewhere in between wakefulness and wherever sleep takes you, I am genuinely glad you're here. This is the Sleepy Griot, and this is a place where Africa's stories get to breathe, where history isn't rushed, isn't shrunk down to a paragraph in someone else's textbook, and isn't forgotten. This is where the full, extraordinary, sometimes heartbreaking, always astonishing truth gets to be told. Slowly, warmly, the way stories were always meant to be told. Around a fire, in the dark, with time. Before we begin tonight, I want to ask you something small. Drop a comment, just your city, your country, or even just the time it is where you are right now. There's something quietly beautiful that happens in that comment section. People from Nairobi and Accra, from Toronto and London, from Port Harcourt and Paris and Melbourne, all listening to the same story at the same moment. It turns this channel into something that feels less like a video and more like a gathering. And I love that. I really do. If you're new here, welcome. Genuinely. If this is the kind of content that helps you rest, helps you feel something, helps you learn while the world slows down, then consider subscribing. It means more than I can properly say. Now, let's begin. Someone, somewhere made a decision. Not a small one, not a quiet one made in a private room and quickly forgotten. This was a large, deliberate, generational decision. The kind that takes centuries to carry out. The kind where you slowly and carefully remove a people from their own story. You take their libraries and call them primitive. You take their cities and insist they must have been built by someone else. You take their sciences, their philosophies, their governance, their medicine, and you bury all of it under silence and misdirection and an education system designed to make sure the next generation never asked the right questions. But here's what they did not count on. The story survived anyway. They survived in the stones of buildings still standing after 1,000 years. They survived in manuscripts packed into clay jars and hidden in desert homes. They survived in the mouths of grandmothers and the songs of fishermen and the careful memories of griots. The storytellers, the history keepers, the ones whose entire purpose was to make sure nothing was ever truly lost. Tonight, we are going to reclaim 50 of those stories. 50 facts about African history that were never put in your textbooks. 50 truths that were quietly set aside, misattributed, minimized, or simply never mentioned. And every single one of them will change something in the way you see this continent and the people who built their lives upon it. So get comfortable, let your body settle, let your breath slow down, because we have a long, beautiful journey ahead of us tonight. And it begins, as the greatest journeys always do, at the very beginning. Chapter 1, the kingdoms they erased from the map. Close your eyes for just a moment and try to picture the world as it looked 4,000 years ago. Not the world as you learned in school. Not the neat timelines with Greece at the center and Rome arriving fashionably after, with everyone else waiting quietly in the wings. Forget that version. That version was written by people with a reason to write it a certain way. Now, picture the actual world. The real one. The one that was actually happening. In the valley of the Nile, a civilization so vast and so precise that it took modern engineers centuries just to understand its mathematics was already ancient. already thousands of years old, already building things that our best technology today still struggles to fully explain. And stretching south of that civilization, deeper into the continent, further into the places that were never supposed to matter, were kingdoms, empires, cities, universities, trade routes, and systems of government so sophisticated they would make most modern capitals look young. This is where we begin, not with a date, not with a king's name or battle. We begin with a feeling, the feeling of standing in front of something enormous and finally letting yourself see it for what it actually is. Fact number one, Africa is not the birthplace of civilization. Africa is the birthplace of humanity itself. Let that land softly, because there is a difference between those two things, and the difference matters. For most of recorded Western history, the story went something like this. Civilization began in the Middle East, spread through Greece and Rome, and eventually touched the rest of the world. Africa was always somewhere in that story's margins, a footnote, a backdrop, a place things passed through rather than a place things began. But modern genetics, the actual science of human DNA, not theory, not opinion, has now confirmed what many African traditions always quietly knew. Every human being alive on this earth today traces their ancestry back to Africa. Every single one. The Khoisan people of southern Africa, a group living in the deserts and grasslands of Botswana and Namibia and South Africa, carry within their DNA the oldest genetic lineage of any living humans on the planet. Their ancestors were here before anyone else went anywhere, before there were Europeans or Asians or anyone else. There were Africans. There were people standing on this soil, looking up at the sky, figuring out how to survive and love and build a life. We are all, each of us, originally African. That is not poetry. That is science. Fact number two. The Great Pyramid of Giza was the tallest structure human beings had ever built, and it held that title for nearly 4,000 years. Think about that for a moment. Not 40 years, not 400, nearly 4,000 years. The pyramid was completed around 2560 BC. It was not surpassed in height until the Lincoln Cathedral was built in England in 1311 CE. That is an unbroken record of almost 4 millennia, during which every person alive on this earth looked up and knew that the tallest thing ever made by human hands was in Africa. And yet, for a long time, and sometimes even now, there were voices insisting that ancient Egyptians could not possibly have built it, that it must have been aliens, that it must have been some lost civilization from elsewhere, that the people who lived there, the dark-skinned, African-featured people whose faces we can still see in their own paintings on their own walls, simply couldn't have done something so extraordinary. They did, and they didn't stop there. The Great Pyramid is aligned so precisely with true north that its margin of error is only 1/15 of a single degree. The ancient Egyptians achieved this without GPS, without satellites, without anything we would recognize as modern surveying equipment. They did it through observation, through mathematics, through a mastery of astronomy that they have been developing and refining for generations. The precision is not accidental. It is intentional. It is the mark of a civilization that understood the stars the way some people understand their own neighborhood, intimately, personally, without needing to be told where anything was. Fact number three. Ancient Egyptians invented the 365-day calendar. Long before Julius Caesar reformed the Roman calendar, Long before Europe had any calendar worth speaking of, Egyptian astronomers had already mapped the solar year and divided it into 365 days. Their calendar was built around the flooding of the Nile and the movements of the star Sirius, which they called Sopdet. When Sirius appeared on the horizon just before dawn, they knew the flood was coming. They built their entire agricultural system, their entire civic life, their entire religious calendar around this precise celestial observation. The calendar Julius Caesar eventually adopted, the one that most of the modern world still uses as its foundation, was directly based on the Egyptian model. Caesar didn't invent it. He borrowed it, adjusted it slightly, and put his own name on the month of July. We use African mathematics every time we mark a day on the calendar. We just were never told. Fact number 4. The kingdom of Kush, ancient Nubia, in what is now Sudan, did not simply exist alongside Egypt. At one point in history, Kush conquered Egypt and ruled it. This is one of those facts that tends to make rooms go very quiet. The 25th dynasty of Egypt, which ruled from roughly 744 BCE to 656 BCE, was a Nubian dynasty. The pharaohs were Kushite kings, men from deep in the African interior, south of the traditional Egyptian border, who marched north and took one of the most powerful thrones on earth. Their names were Pi, Shabaka, Taharka. They were celebrated in their time. Taharka is even mentioned in the Bible. In the Book of Kings, he is described as a great king who sent his army to assist the Israelites against the Assyrians. These were not foreign invaders in the way the word conqueror sometimes implies. The Kushites and Egyptians have been intertwined for centuries, trading, intermarrying, sharing religious traditions, but the power shift was real and it was significant. For nearly 100 years, the most powerful throne in the known world was occupied by a black African king from the deep interior of the continent. When Taharka's image was carved into the monuments of that era, it was carved with the full regalia of Egyptian kingship, the double crown, the crook and flail, but with distinctly Nubian features. His face, preserved in stone for more than 2,500 years, is not the face of ambiguity. It is a face of a man from sub-Saharan Africa, sitting on the throne of one of history's greatest civilizations. Fact number 5. South of Egypt, the kingdom of Aksum, centered in what is now northern Ethiopia, became one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world, and it was one of the very first kingdoms anywhere on earth to officially adopt Christianity as its state religion, before Rome, before Byzantium had settled into its identity, before most of Europe had any organized religion at all. A kingdom in the African highlands had already embraced the Christian faith and made it the official spiritual foundation of its governance. This happened in the 4th century CE under King Ezana, and it wasn't a quiet, uncertain conversion. Ezana issued coins, actual currency, the kind that traveled along trade routes and ended up in the hands of merchants across the ancient world, bearing the cross. He was broadcasting it. He was saying, "This is who we are. This is what we stand for. Come and do business with a Christian kingdom." Aksum was not a peripheral power. At its height, it controlled trade routes stretching from the Mediterranean to India. It had its own written script, Guizi, which is still used in Ethiopian Orthodox religious texts today. It built towering stone obelisks called stelae, some of them over 30 meters tall, carved from single pieces of granite with extraordinary precision. One of those obelisks was stolen by Mussolini's forces in 1937 and taken to Rome, where it stood for decades before finally being returned to Ethiopia in 2005. Even in theft, Africa's monuments were magnificent enough to be worth stealing. Fact number 6. The city of Timbuktu, in what is now Mali, was at its height in the 15th and 16th centuries, one of the greatest centers of learning on the surface of the earth. Most people, when they hear the name Timbuktu, think of a joke, a punchline, a way of saying something is impossibly far away. In the middle of nowhere, the phrase entered popular use as a dismissal, as proof of how successfully the truth was buried. Because the actual Timbuktu, the real one, the historical one, was the opposite of nowhere. It was the center of everything. The Sankore University in Timbuktu enrolled, at its peak, around 25,000 students. To give that number some context, the University of Oxford, one of the oldest universities in the Western world, had roughly 3,000 students at the same period in history. Timbuktu had 8 times that number studying within its walls. Students came from across Africa, from the Arab world, from Europe, because the scholarship happening there was at the very frontier of human knowledge: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, philosophy, theology, literature, poetry, and the physical evidence of this learning still exists. Across the homes and libraries of Timbuktu and the surrounding region, historians and archivists have recovered more than 1 million manuscripts. 1 million, written in Arabic and Guizi and various African languages. Some of them detail surgical procedures. Some of them contain mathematical proofs. Some of them are poetry collections of extraordinary beauty. Some of them are political treatises on the nature of just governance that read, in translation, with the same intelligence and nuance as anything Plato or Aristotle ever wrote. These manuscripts exist. They are real. They are currently being digitized and preserved by a network of African and international scholars working against time, because some of them are fragile, some of them are threatened, and some of them were damaged or destroyed when jihadist extremists attacked the city of Timbuktu in 2012 and deliberately burned cultural heritage in the name of an ideology that feared what knowledge might do. Even today, someone is still trying to silence those voices. They have not succeeded. Fact number 7. Mansa Musa, the 14th century emperor of the Mali Empire, was, by any serious historical and economic calculation, the wealthiest individual human being who has ever lived. Wealthier than Elon Musk, wealthier than Jeff Bezos, wealthier than any oil magnate, any tech billionaire, any king or queen of the modern era. Adjusted for historical context and the value of his resources, economic historians estimate Mansa Musa's personal fortune at somewhere between $400 billion and $4 trillion in today's terms. Numbers so large they stop making sense as numbers and start functioning more as concepts. The source of this wealth was gold. Mali sat on some of the richest gold deposits on Earth, and Mansa Musa controlled them entirely. At a time when Europe was scratching to the soil of a continent still recovering from plague, the Mali Empire was producing more than half of the world's entire supply of gold. In 1324, Mansa Musa made a pilgrimage to Mecca, a journey required of Muslims who have a means to make it, and the way he made that journey changed the world. He traveled with a caravan of 60,000 people. His personal retinue included 12,000 enslaved servants, each carrying 4 pounds of gold. 500 heralds walked ahead of him, each one carrying a 6-pound golden staff. He brought 80 camels, each loaded with 300 pounds of gold dust. He gave freely and extravagantly everywhere he went, to the poor, to mosques, to scholars, to merchants. He passed through Cairo, And when he left, he had spent and given away so much gold that the Egyptian economy collapsed. Gold lost its value so dramatically because the market was suddenly flooded with it that Egypt experienced severe inflation for more than 12 years after Musa Musa passed through. 12 years. A single man's generosity on his way to prayer disrupted an entire nation's economy for over a decade. When Musa Musa eventually appeared on European maps, and he did, he was drawn on the Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most important maps of the medieval world. Sitting on a throne and holding a golden orb, he was labeled simply as the richest king in the world. The European cartographers didn't have more superlatives than that. He had used them all up. Fact number 8. The ancient Egyptians performed brain surgery. Let that sit for a moment in the quiet of wherever you are. Archaeological evidence from ancient Egyptian medical sites, including a document known as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which dates to around 1600 BCE, but is believed to be a copy of an even older text, shows detailed, systematic instructions for treating traumatic head injuries, including what we would now call trepanation, the practice of drilling or cutting into the skull to relieve pressure on the brain. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is not a mystical text. It is not a collection of spells or prayers. It is a clinical document. It describes 48 individual cases of injury, each one analyzed with rationality and precision that feels startlingly modern. For each case, the physician notes the symptoms, makes a diagnosis, offers a prognosis, favorable, uncertain, or untreatable, and prescribes a course of action. There is no invocation of gods. There is no magic cure. There is observation. There is reasoning. There is medicine. Egyptian physicians also performed what appears to be the first recorded cesarean section. They used anesthesia derived from plants. They performed dental procedures including tooth extraction and the fitting of prosthetics. An actual functional prosthetic wooden toe, estimated to be 3,000 years old, was found on a mummy, attached with leather straps and worn smooth from years of use. Someone had it fitted. Someone wore it every day. It worked. African medicine was not primitive. It was in many respects ahead of the world around it by centuries. Fact number 9. Ancient Egyptian women had legal rights that women in Europe would not achieve for another 2,000 years. In ancient Egypt, a woman could own property. She could inherit it, sell it, and leave it to whomever she chose when she died. She could file lawsuits and be a party in legal contracts. She could divorce her husband, not simply be divorced by him, but actively initiate the separation herself. And when she did, she was entitled to take her own possessions and a portion of the marital property with her. She could run a business. She could lend money at interest. She could testify in court. Compare this to England in the 1800s, less than 200 years ago, where a married woman legally ceased to exist as an independent person. She could not own property. She could not sign a contract. Anything she had before marriage became her husband's the moment the ceremony was completed. She had no legal standing separate from him. The ancient Egyptian woman, living 4,000 years earlier in the Valley of the Nile, had more legal autonomy than her English counterpart in the 19th century. This is not a small thing. This is a civilizational statement. Fact number 10. And then there is Great Zimbabwe, not the country, Though Zimbabwe, the nation, did take its name from this place, because naming yourself after the greatest thing your ancestors built is a reasonable and beautiful choice. Great Zimbabwe is a city, a real city, a city of stone walls and towers and palaces and courtyards, built without a single drop of mortar, just stone, precisely shaped and carefully fitted, stone resting against stone in a system of interlocking balance that has kept these walls standing for more than 700 years. At its height, around the 14th century CE, Great Zimbabwe housed somewhere between 10,000 and 18,000 people. It was the capital of a kingdom that controlled gold trade across much of southern Africa. Its walls, in places, rise to 11 meters high and 5 meters thick. The Great Enclosure, the largest single ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa, contains over 1 million individual hand-cut stones. When European explorers arrived in the 19th century and saw it standing there in the Zimbabwean highlands, their reaction was not wonder, it was denial. They wrote that it must have been built by Phoenicians, by Arabs, by the Queen of Sheba, by anyone other than the ancestors of the people who were living right there beside it. One German explorer, Karl Mauch, suggested in 1871 that the cedarwood beams he found inside must have come from Solomon's temple, and therefore the city must have been built by ancient Israelites. Archaeological evidence has since proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Great Zimbabwe was built by the Shona people, the ancestors of the Shona who live in Zimbabwe today. The pottery, the artifacts, the oral traditions, the DNA evidence, all of it points to the same conclusion. The people who built it were African. Their descendants were standing right there when the Europeans arrived, and they were looking at the walls their great-great-grandparents had raised with their own hands. The denial wasn't born of evidence. It was born of the inability to believe that something so magnificent could have been made by people who were being simultaneously described as incapable of civilization. Both things could not be true at the same time, so one of them had to be denied. Tonight, we are choosing truth instead. And what a beginning it is, because we have barely scratched the surface. We walked through 10 facts, and already the world looks different. Already the map is larger, more luminous, more full of names and faces and genius than the version most of us were handed as children. But the kingdoms and their monuments are only one layer of this story. Beneath it is something even more extraordinary, the human beings who live inside these histories. The warriors who terrified armies 3 times their size. The queens who made emperors flinch. The women and men who looked impossibly difficult circumstances in the face and refused, absolutely refused, to bend. Rest your eyes. Let your breathing slow. The next chapter is already waiting. It belongs to some of the most fierce, brilliant, and unforgettable people who ever walked this earth. Chapter 2, The Warriors, Queens, and Rebels. There is a particular kind of person that history tries to erase first. Not the kings who cooperated. Not the leaders who signed the agreements and accepted the terms and smiled for the portraits. Those people get statues. Those people get chapters in approved textbooks and holidays named after them, and their faces pressed onto currency. No, the ones history tries hardest to erase are the ones who said no, the ones who looked at an invading force and refused to be impressed, the ones who gathered their people, sharpened whatever they had, and walked forward anyway. not because they were foolish, not because they didn't understand the odds, but because some things are worth the cost of refusal. The ones who made empires uncomfortable. The ones whose names, even now, carry a kind of electricity, a charge that hasn't fully discharged even across the centuries, separating us from the moments when they were alive and breathing and absolutely, completely, magnificently unwilling to surrender. Africa produced more of these people than anywhere else on Earth, and most of us were never told a single one of their names. Tonight, we fix that. Fact number 11. Queen Amanirenas of Kush, the one-eyed warrior queen, fought the Roman Empire to a standstill and won. Let that rest in the air for a moment. The Roman Empire, the same force that swallowed Gaul and Carthage and most of the known world, the same military machine that Julius Caesar had used to reshape entire continents. That empire, and a one-eyed African queen from the Nile Valley looked it in the face and refused to move. It was around 24 BC. Rome had just annexed Egypt under Augustus Caesar. The Romans, flush with confidence, had reduced a military garrison in southern Egypt to move troops elsewhere. Amanirenas saw the opening and took it. Her forces swept north across the Egyptian border, sacked Roman settlements, tore down statues of Augustus Caesar, and, in what may be the most pointed symbolic act of defiance in ancient history, buried one of those statues' heads beneath the steps of a temple back home in Meroe, so that for generations afterward, every person who walked into that sacred space would tread upon the face of the emperor who thought he could own the Nile. Rome responded with force. A Roman general named Petronius drove her forces back, took prisoners, burned cities. But Amanirenas did not collapse. She reorganized. She continued fighting. And eventually, Augustus Caesar, the man who had absorbed empires, the man whose power stretched from Britain to Persia, sat down at a negotiating table and agreed to a peace treaty with her on terms that were remarkably favorable to Kush. Rome pulled back. Rome waived the tribute it had demanded. Rome recognized Kushite sovereignty over territory it had originally claimed. A queen with one eye and an unbreakable spine had negotiated the Roman Empire down. Her name should be spoken in every history classroom on Earth. And yet, most people have never heard it. Fact number 12. Yeah, a Sandoval was a grandmother. She was in her 60s when, in the year 1900, she stood in front of the chiefs of the Ashanti people in what is now Ghana and delivered one of the most remarkable speeches in the history of African resistance. The British had exiled the Ashanti king, Agyeman Prempeh, to the Seychelles Islands, far away, across the ocean, removed from his people. Then the British colonial governor, Sir Frederick Hodgson, arrived in the Ashanti capital of Kumasi and made a demand so audacious it stunned the room into silence. He demanded to sit on the golden stool. To understand why this was not simply an arrogant request, but profound desecration, you need to understand what the golden stool was. It was not a chair. It was not even really a throne in the sense that outsiders understood thrones. The golden stool, Sikat DWA Kofi, was and remains the spiritual soul of the Ashanti nation. It was believed to contain the sunsum, the collective spirit of the entire Ashanti people. It had never touched the ground. It had never been sat upon, not even by the king himself. To sit upon it was not an act of authority. It was an act of annihilation. The chiefs of the Ashanti fell quiet. Some of them were considering compliance. Some of them were weighing the size of the British force against the size of their own. And then, Santua, the queen mother of Ejisu, stood up. She said, and these words were recorded by those who were present, that if the men of the Ashanti would not stand up for their dignity, then the women would. She said that in her mother's time, Ashanti men did not sit quietly while strangers came to take what was sacred. She called the men cowards to their faces, in front of the assembly, in front of the chiefs, in front of everyone, and then she picked up a rifle. The Ashanti War of 1900, which the British came to call the War of the Golden Stool, lasted months. Asanwa commanded the Ashanti forces personally, directing strategy, inspiring soldiers, refusing every offer of negotiation that didn't include the return of her king and the preservation of Ashanti sovereignty. The British eventually captured her and exiled her to the Seychelles, where she died in 1921, and where, just a year later, the Ashanti king was finally allowed to return home. She never came back, but the Golden Stool was never surrendered. It exists today, still sacred, still protected, still the living spirit of a people who refuse to let a grandmother's courage go to waste. Fact number 13. Shaka Zulu did not simply build an army. He invented a new way of making war. Before Shaka, the battles fought among the various chiefdoms of southern Africa followed a particular pattern. Formal, almost ritualized, with both sides agreeing to meet at a certain place, hurling spears from a distance, and declaring a winner when one side retreated. It was more like an organized dispute than what we would recognize as warfare. Casualties were relatively low. Wars ended quickly. Shaka changed everything. Born around 1787, he rose to lead the Zulu people in the early 1800s and immediately began reimagining his fighting force from the ground up. He replaced the long throwing spear with a short stabbing spear called the assegai because he wanted his warriors' clothes. He introduced a large cowhide shield used not just for protection, but as a weapon in its own right, hooking the enemy's shield and turning them sideways, exposing their flank. And then he invented the bullhorn formation, Impondo Zankamo, one of the most devastatingly effective battlefield tactics in military history. The chest of the formation engaged the enemy directly, pinning them in place. The two horns swept wide around both flanks simultaneously, encircling the enemy completely before they could react. The loins, reserve force held back, sitting with their backs to battle, so they didn't get excited and commit too early, were deployed only where needed. Military historians have compared this formation to tactics used by Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae and later studied by generals throughout European military history. Shaka developed it independently, from nothing, through observation and innovation on the grasslands of southern Africa. At the height of his power, the Zulu kingdom under Shaka had expanded from a small chiefdom of roughly 1,500 people into a nation of more than 250,000, controlling a territory the size of modern-day Switzerland. Neighboring kingdoms either allied themselves with him or ceased to exist. The upheaval his military expansion caused, known as the Mfikane, meaning the crushing, reshaped the population and political geography of an entire subcontinent. He was assassinated in 1828 by his own half-brothers. But the military system he built was so effective that it held the British Army, one of the most powerful military forces the world had ever seen, to a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Isernia in 1879, more than 50 years after his death. His name echoes across the grassland still. Fact number 14. Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, in what is now Angola, spent nearly 40 years refusing to accept Portuguese colonial control, and she did it with a brilliance that was equal parts military strategy, political theater, and pure, relentless nerve. She was born around 1583 and came to power at a moment when the Portuguese were systematically dismantling the kingdoms of Central Africa to feed the transatlantic slave trade. Her brother, the King of Ndongo, was under enormous pressure. When he sent Nzinga to negotiate with the Portuguese governor in Luanda, she arrived and found a room designed to humiliate her. There was no chair provided for her, only floor mats, while the governor sat elevated above her. The message was clear: you are beneath us. Nzinga looked around the room, then gestured to one of her attendants. The attendant came forward, got on hands and knees, and Nzinga sat on their back. She conducted the entire negotiation from that position, elevated, composed, unbothered, every inch a queen receiving a lesser official. She secured favorable terms that day, but the Portuguese had no intention of honoring them. When war became inevitable, Nzinga became a warrior queen. She allied with the Dutch, who were rivals of the Portuguese, to push back colonial forces. She created a coalition of neighboring kingdoms. She led campaigns personally. She lived in the field with her soldiers, ate what they ate, slept in the same conditions, and was known to dress in male warrior attire when commanding troops, not to disguise herself, but command the full authority that military leadership carried. She fought until she was in her 80s. She died in 1663, at around 80 years old, still ruling, still sovereign over a territory the Portuguese had never managed to fully control. The transatlantic slave trade continued after her death, and it was devastating. But she had held a line for 4 decades. She had kept her people's sovereignty alive through sheer refusal to accept that it could be otherwise. Some fires take a very long time to extinguish. Fact number 15. The Dahomey Amazons, known in their own language as the Agoji, were one of the most feared military units in 19th century West Africa, and they were entirely made up of women. The Kingdom of Dahomey, in what is now Benin, maintained a standing army of female soldiers for approximately 200 years, from the mid-17th century until French colonial conquest in the 1890s. These were not ceremonial guards. They were not symbolic. They were the most elite combat force in the Dahomey military, better trained, better disciplined, and by multiple accounts, more ferocious in battle than their male counterparts. European visitors to the Dahomey court in the 19th century rode home with a mixture of awe and barely concealed fear. One French naval officer described watching the Agoji train and noted that they moved with precision and intensity unlike anything he had seen in European armies. They went through grueling physical conditioning. They trained in hand-to-hand combat with muskets, with machetes. They slept in the palace, took vows of celibacy during their service, and swore absolute loyalty to the king. In battle, they were often assigned the most difficult objectives, storming fortified positions, spearheading assaults, leading the charge into the places where casualties were highest. They earned their reputation in blood and fire, and the neighboring kingdoms of Dahome's enemies knew their name and spoke it with a distinct quality of unease. When the French arrived in the 1890s with superior firepower and began the conquest of Dahomey, the Agoji were among the last and most determined defenders. French soldiers wrote in their battlefield accounts that the female warriors were extraordinarily difficult to defeat, that they fought with ferocity that left even battle-hardened European troops unsettled. The French eventually won the war, as the calculus of industrialized weaponry against traditional arms tends to go, but the Agoji made them pay for every inch. Their story inspired the 2022 film The Woman King. Thousands of people discovered them through that film and were stunned to learn that this was not invented for Hollywood. It had been real all along. Fact number 16. Sundiata Keita was a boy who could not walk. He was born into the royal family of the Mandinka people in what is now Guinea and Mali around the early 13th century. From childhood, he was unable to stand or move on his own. His legs would not support him. In a royal court filled with people watching for weakness, in a time when physical strength and the ability to command in battle were inseparable from the right to lead, this was considered proof that he was not fit to rule. His mother was humiliated. His half-brothers mocked him. And when a succession crisis forced his family to flee the court, they left with almost nothing: a crippled boy and a grieving mother, and the knowledge that the world had already decided their story was over. But somewhere on the road between exile and the future, Sundiata Keita stood up. The oral traditions of the Mandinka people say it differently each time, and each version carries its own truth. In some, it happened suddenly, on a single miraculous morning. In others, it is gradual, days of effort, of pulling himself up against an iron rod that bent under his weight, until the iron bent and his legs did not. However it happened, he stood, and once he was standing, he did not stop moving for the rest of his life. He returned, gathered allies, built an army from the fragments of kingdoms shattered by the Sasso ruler Semangirikani, a man who had made himself feared across the region through military conquest and a reputation for ruthlessness. And at the Battle of Karina, around 1235 CE, Sundiata Keita defeated him. From that victory, he founded the Mali Empire, one of the largest and wealthiest empires in the history of the medieval world. The same empire that would later produce Mansa Musa, the same empire whose universities would fill with 25,000 students, the same empire whose goal would eventually collapse the Egyptian economy. It all began with a boy who wasn't supposed to walk, deciding that he would. Fact number 17. The Battle of Adwa, fought on the 1st of March, 1896, was a moment when an African nation defeated a European colonial power so completely and so publicly that it shook the entire European imperial project to its foundations. Ethiopia. The Italians have been attempting to colonize it for years, chipping away at the edges, signing treaties, maneuvering politically. Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia, a brilliant strategist with an extraordinary gift for managing alliances, had been watching them carefully. When the Italians presented a treaty that in its Italian version, effectively made Ethiopia an Italian protectorate, while the Amharic translation said something entirely different. Menelik recognized the deception immediately, rejected the treaty entirely, and began preparing for war. He and his wife, Empress Teta Batul, who was herself a formidable political force, mobilized an Ethiopian army of somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 soldiers. This was not a guerrilla force. This was a standing national army, armed with modern rifles that Ethiopia had been acquiring through shrewd diplomatic and trade relationships. The Italian army that marched to meet them was confident to the point of arrogance. At the Battle of Adwa, the Ethiopian forces surrounded and destroyed the Italian army. Approximately 7,000 Italian soldiers died that day. Roughly 1,500 were captured. The Italian General Baratieri was relieved of his command. Italy was forced to sign the Treaty of Addis Ababa, which recognized Ethiopia's full, unconditional sovereignty. This was 1896, at the very height of European colonialism, when the entire continent of Africa was being carved up at conference tables in Berlin, when the prevailing ideology of the age insisted that African peoples were not capable of self-governance. A 50-something-year-old emperor and his empress had just destroyed a European army in open field battle. The reverberations were immediate. African and Caribbean resistance movements cited Adwa for decades afterward as proof of what was possible. When Haile Selassie became emperor of Ethiopia in 1930, he chose Addis Ababa, the city Menelik had built, as his capital and carried the legacy of Adwa as a living testament. The Ethiopian flag became a symbol of Pan-African liberation that still appears on the flags of several other African nations today, that green, yellow, and red, because Adwa had made it the color of defiance. Fact number 18. Harriet Tubman, known to Americans as the woman who led enslaved people to freedom via the Underground Railroad, was also, less commonly known, a Union Army spy and military commander during the American Civil War, and she drew directly on the guerrilla military traditions that enslaved Africans had brought with them from the continent. The knowledge of how to move through difficult terrain, how to read the land, how to use darkness and water and sound. This was not invented in the swamps of South Carolina. It was carried across the Atlantic in the memories of people whose ancestors had hunted and fought and navigated some of the most complex environments on Earth. Tubman led the Combahee River Raid in June 1863, guiding 3 Union gunboats through Confederate mined waters using intelligence she had gathered personally from a network of local informants. The raid liberated more than 700 enslaved people in a single night. It remains one of the most successful military intelligence operations of the entire Civil War. She did this while suffering from narcolepsy, a neurological condition that caused sudden sleep episodes, which she had developed as a result of a severe head injury inflicted by an enslaver when she was a teenager. She led raids through enemy territory with a condition that could cause her to lose consciousness without warning, and she never lost a single person in her care. The African tradition of resistance didn't stay in Africa. It crossed the water in the bodies and minds of the people who carried it. It bloomed in the swamps of Carolina and the fields of Jamaica and the mountains of Haiti, and wherever human beings who descended from warriors decided again and again and again that they would not accept what the world had decided for them. Fact number 19. The Haitian Revolution, completed in 1804, produced the only successful slave revolt in recorded human history, and its spiritual and organizational backbone was an African religious ceremony held in a clearing in the woods. On the night of August 14, 1791, in a forest clearing called Bois Cayman, a ceremony was held. A Vodou Houngan, a priest named Didi Boukman, led it, along with a woman named Cecile Fatimon. What happened there was not merely religious. It was the lighting of a fuse. The enslaved people gathered in that clearing were predominantly from West and Central Africa, Fon, Yoruba, Congo, Mande. People had been brought to the Caribbean in chains, but who had preserved their spiritual traditions, their community structures, their sense of shared identity through Vodou. And Vodou was not simply a religion in the way the word is sometimes used dismissively. It was a complete system, a way of understanding the world, of maintaining community bonds, of drawing strength from ancestral connection, of organizing collective action in a place where collective action was punishable by death. The Bois Cayman ceremony bound participants together in shared commitment. Boukman's words, recorded in fragments and paraphrased across many sources, called upon God, a God he explicitly described as one who demanded justice, not submission, a God who was watching and whose patience with cruelty had run out. 12 days later, the Haitian Revolution began. 13 years after that, on the 1st of January 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines declared the independent Republic of Haiti, the first black republic in the history of the modern world. The name itself was reclaimed. Haiti comes from the Taino word Ayatai, meaning land of high mountains. The original name of the island before was renamed by colonizers. France, which had owned Haiti as its most profitable colony, eventually demanded reparations, payment for the loss of its enslaved workforce. Haiti paid those reparations, a debt so enormous it took 122 years to fully repay. 122 years of a nation paying money to the country that had enslaved its people for the crime of setting itself free. That story, in its full horror, is one of history's most quietly devastating facts. And it begins in a forest at night with an African priest calling the spirits and a group of people deciding that tonight was the night. Fact number 20. Nihanda Charwe Nayakasakana was a spirit medium, a woman believed to be possessed by the ancestral spirit Nihanda, who led one of the first armed resistances against British colonial rule in what is now Zimbabwe. And when they executed her in 1898, her final words became a prophecy. She said, "My bones will rise again." She was referring to the idea that her spirit, her resistance, her legacy would return in the bodies of those who came after her. It was not metaphor. It was, in the tradition of Shona people, a literal spiritual statement that the work was not finished, that the spirit does not die, that what she had started will be continued. In the 1970s, when the liberation war against the white minority government of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, intensified, the freedom fighters called themselves the Children of Nihanda. They invoked her name in their songs and their oaths. Her image appeared on posters. Her words, "My bones will rise again," became the anthem of an entire liberation movement. When Zimbabwe achieved independence in 1980, nearly a century after her execution, she was declared a national heroine, A statue of her was unveiled in central Harare in 2021. Her spirit medium tradition, her courage, her defiance, all of it had been carried forward through the decades by ordinary people who refused to let a dead woman stay silent. She was not wrong. Her bones did rise. They rose in every generation of Zimbabweans who chose freedom over submission, and they are rising still. 10 names, 10 lives, 10 moments when individual human beings stood at the intersection of history and personal courage and chose a harder, more luminous path. And yet, we have still only told part of the story, because resistance is only one half of what was built on this continent. The other half, perhaps the quieter, stranger, more astonishing half, is what Africa created before anyone came to take it. The things that were built not in fire and resistance, but in peace and patience and the long, careful accumulation of human knowledge. The scholars, the architects, the astronomers, the mathematicians who were doing things with numbers that the rest of the world hadn't even begun to dream of yet. Let the sounds around you soften. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm. Because the next part of this story belongs to the builders and the thinkers, and what they made will stay with you long after tonight becomes tomorrow. Chapter 3. The Scholars, Builders, and Stargazers. There is a particular kind of genius that doesn't announce itself with a sword. It doesn't arrive on horseback or thunder across a battlefield or plant a flag in conquered soil. It arrives quietly. It arrives in the early morning, before the rest of the world is awake, when someone sits down in front of a problem that no one has solved before and decides, with nothing but patience and intelligence and an almost unreasonable faith in the power of the human mind, that today might be the day they figure it out. This kind of genius is harder to romanticize. It doesn't make for the same dramatic paintings or stirring legends, but it is, in many ways, the more extraordinary kind, because a warrior needs a battle to reveal what they are. A thinker needs only silence and time. And across this continent, for thousands of years before anyone outside its borders was paying attention, there was an extraordinary amount of both. Africa's scholars didn't need validation from the outside world to do what they did. They were too busy doing it. Fact number 21. The oldest mathematical object ever discovered anywhere on Earth was found in Africa. It is called the Shango bone, and it is a small baboon fibula, a leg bone, carved with a series of notches arranged in deliberate, organized groups. It was discovered in 1960 in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, near the shores of Lake Edward, at a site called Ishango. It has been dated to somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 years ago. 25,000 years. Let that number breathe for a moment. The notches on the bone are not random. Mathematical analysis has shown that they appear to represent prime numbers, numbers divisible only by one in themselves. The groupings on the bone correspond to the prime numbers between 10 and 20, 11, 13, 17, 19. Some researchers have also interpreted the bone as an early lunar calendar, a way of tracking the phases of the moon across a period of several months. Whether the Shango bone represents an early lunar calendar or a mathematical table of prime numbers, and it may well be both, what it tells us is undeniable. 25,000 years ago, on the banks of a lake in Central Africa, a human being was thinking carefully about numbers. They were noticing patterns in the world around them. They were recording those patterns in a durable medium, in a deliberate sequence, with an organizational logic that has survived intact long enough for us to sit here tonight and still be able to read it. Mathematics did not begin in ancient Greece. It began in ancient Africa, in the hands of someone sitting by a lake, watching the moon. Fact number 22. The ancient Egyptians understood and used pi, the mathematical constant that describes the relationship between a circle's circumference and its diameter, nearly 4,000 years ago. This is documented in the Rhind Mathematical Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian text dating to around 1550 BC, which is itself a copy of an even older document. The papyrus contains 84 mathematical problems with worked solutions, essentially an ancient textbook. Among those problems are calculations involving circles, and the value used for pi in those calculations is accurate to within 1% of the modern value we use today. 1%, nearly 4,000 years ago. The same papyrus also demonstrates knowledge of arithmetic progressions, geometric series, and a method for calculating the area of curved surfaces. Egyptian mathematicians understood fractions. They had a sophisticated system for expressing them that, while different from the notation we use now, was logically consistent and fully functional. They understood algebra, not as a named discipline with Greek letters and formal notation, but as a practical problem-solving method they applied to real architectural and engineering challenges every single day. The people who built the pyramids were not following instructions handed down by a more advanced civilization. They were the advanced civilization. They were doing the mathematics themselves. Fact number 23. In the highlands of what is now Kenya, the Borana people developed a calendar system so sophisticated that astronomers at the Smithsonian Institution, when they studied it in detail in the 1970s, described it as one of the most remarkable timekeeping systems ever developed by a non-literate society. The Borana calendar, Gada, is based on a complex combination of 7 specific stars and star clusters observed at precise points in the night sky, combined with the phases of the moon. It is not a simple lunar calendar. It is a system that accounts for the irregularities between lunar and solar cycles, using stellar observations to make corrections, which is exactly the kind of problem that plagued European calendar makers for centuries and was only definitively solved with the Gregorian reform of 1582. The Borana have been solving it through careful observation and oral transmission for generations before European astronomers finished arguing about it. The calendar was maintained by specialists called Ayayanchu, timekeepers, whose entire social function was to observe the stars, track the cycles, and communicate the correct dates to their communities. This was not a casual responsibility. The calendar regulated planting, migration, ritual, governance, conflict, and peace. Getting it wrong had consequences. Getting it right, generation after generation, century after century, required a precision and dedication that deserves to be called exactly what it was: science. Fact number 24. The University of Al-Qarawiyyin, founded in Fez, Morocco in 859 CE, is recognized by UNESCO and the Guinness World Records as the oldest continuously operating university in the world. Not the oldest in Africa, the oldest in the world. And it was founded by a woman. Her name was Fatima Al-Firi. She was the daughter of a wealthy merchant from the city of Kairouan, in what is now Tunisia. When her father died, she inherited a substantial fortune, and she used it entirely, every last coin, to build a mosque and an institution of learning that would be open to those who sought knowledge. Fatima al-Fihri reportedly waited until the building was complete before she broke her fast, observing a spiritual dedication to the project that turned its construction into a kind of extended devotional act. She did not build it for her own glory. She built it because she believed that the best thing a person could do with resources was expand the reach of understanding. The institution she founded has been teaching continuously for over 1,100 years. It began as a center for Islamic education and gradually expanded into a university in the full sense, teaching grammar, rhetoric, logic, Arabic literature, music, and eventually astronomy and mathematics. Students travel from across the Arab world in Europe, yes, Europe, to study within its walls. Gerber of Aurillac, who later became Pope Sylvester II, studied in Islamic Iberia and brought back mathematical knowledge, including Arabic numerals, the number system that eventually replaced Roman numerals across the entire Western world. From institutions like this one, the numbers you use to count the years, the numbers on your phone and your calendar, and every digital screen you have ever looked at. Their path into Europe ran, in part, through African scholarship. Fact number 25. Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Hajj al-Timbukti, known more simply as Ahmad Baba, was a scholar from Timbuktu who, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, wrote more than 40 books on subjects ranging from Islamic law to grammar to astronomy, authored what is believed to be the first biographical dictionary of West African scholars, and was recognized across the entire scholarly world of his era as one of the greatest intellectuals alive. He was born in 1556 in Timbuktu, at the height of that city's golden age of learning. He was so respected that when the Moroccan Sultan Mansour invaded and sacked Timbuktu in 1591, one of the great catastrophes of West African intellectual history, Ahmad Baba was arrested not because he was a military threat, but because the Sultan considered his influence dangerous. He was taken to Marrakesh in chains. Even in Marrakesh, as a prisoner in a foreign city, Ahmad Baba's reputation was so great that students and scholars came to study under him. He continued teaching. He continued writing. He continued being exactly what he was, because nothing about captivity changed the contents of his mind. He was eventually released and returned to Timbuktu, where he spent the remaining years of his life trying to reassemble what had been lost in the invasion. He had owned one of the largest private libraries in a city full of libraries, more than 1,600 manuscripts. Most were seized when he was arrested. He spent years trying to recover them, writing to contacts across the region, reconstructing what he could from memory. He was a man doing exactly what the Timbuktu scholars had always done, refusing to let knowledge disappear, fighting for its survival with every tool available to him, knowing, in the deepest possible way, that a world without books is a world that has deliberately made itself smaller. Fact number 26. The ancient Nubians, the civilization of Kush, centered in what is now Sudan, built more pyramids in Egypt. This surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time, because the Egyptian pyramids are everywhere in the popular imagination, in films, in symbols, in every conversation about ancient wonders. But there are 138 known ancient Egyptian pyramids. And there are more than 250 Nubian pyramids still standing today at sites, including Meroe, Nuri, and El Kuru. The Nubian pyramids are different in character from the Egyptian ones, narrower and steeper, with a smaller base at sharper angle, rising at a quick, elegant point rather than the broad, expansive angle of Giza. They were built over a longer period, from roughly 700 BC to 350 CE, and they mark the tombs of Kushite kings and queens across more than 1,000 years of royal history. For a long time, these pyramids were barely mentioned in Western histories of the ancient world. When they were mentioned, they were sometimes described as derivative, as if the Kushites had simply imitated their northern neighbors and done a lesser version of the same thing. But architectural analysis tells a different story. The Nubian pyramids represent a distinct aesthetic tradition, a different understanding of what a monument should be and do and say about the person it honors. They are not imitations, they are innovations, and they are still standing. More than 200 of them in the Sudanese desert, baking in the same sun they have faced for 2,000 years. Most tourists never go there. Most maps of ancient wonders never mark them. But they are there, patient, precise, and absolutely real. Fact number 27. The ancient Malian city of Djenné is home to what is considered the largest mud brick building on Earth, the Great Mosque of Djenné, which has been continuously rebuilt and maintained for over 700 years using traditional West African architectural methods. Mud brick architecture, known as adobe in other parts of the world, is one of the oldest building technologies in human history. But the way it was developed and refined in the inland Niger Delta of West Africa represents something genuinely extraordinary. The mud used in Djenné-style construction is mixed with rice husks and organic material, then molded into precise bricks, sun-dried, and assembled with a mortar of the same material into structures of remarkable size and stability. The Great Mosque was first built in the 13th century. The current structure, rebuilt in 1907 on the original foundations, rises to 15 meters at its tallest point, supported by 90 interior columns and buttressed on the exterior by rows of projecting wooden beams that serve both as structural support and as scaffolding during the mosque's annual replastering. That replastering is the extraordinary part. Every year, after the rainy season, the entire community of Djenné gathers for a festival called the crepissage, the replastering. Men and boys carry fresh mud up ladders and spread it across the exterior walls by hand, restoring what the rains have worn away. It is not merely a maintenance operation, it is a communal act of care. A city's relationship with its most sacred building, renewed each year by the hands of everyone who lives inside its shadow. The building has survived because it is not maintained by specialists alone. It is maintained by community, by the understanding, built across 700 years of practice, that a thing worth having is a thing worth tending. Fact number 28. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves a tradition supported by a remarkable body of scholarly evidence that it holds the original Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, for those unfamiliar, was a sacred chest described in the Hebrew Bible as containing the stone tablets on which the Ten Commandments were written. According to Jewish and Christian scripture, it was the most sacred object in the world, housed first in the tabernacle, then in Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. After the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, The Ark disappeared from the historical record. Its fate has been debated by theologians and historians for more than 2,500 years. Ethiopian tradition has a very specific answer to where it went. According to the Keber Nagast, a 14th century Ethiopian religious text that compiles much older oral and written traditions, the Queen of Sheba was an Ethiopian queen named Makeda who visited King Solomon in Jerusalem. She had a son by him. That son, Menelik I, later visited his father in Jerusalem and, upon leaving, took the ark with him, either with Solomon's blessing or without his knowledge, depending on which version of the story you follow, and brought it back to Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church claims that the Ark now rests in a small chapel in the ancient city of Aksum, guarded by a single monk, the keeper of the Ark, who is appointed for life and never leaves the chapel grounds. No one outside this monk is permitted to see it. No photographs have ever been taken inside the chapel. The monk does not give interviews. Scholars debate whether the object in the chapel is the original Ark, a copy, or a sacred replica. What is not in debate is that Ethiopia takes this claim with profound seriousness, that it has shaped the entire national and religious identity of the country for over 1,000 years, and that the connection between Ethiopia and the line of Solomon is woven into the constitutional and spiritual fabric of the nation at its most fundamental level. The last emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, claimed direct descent from Solomon and Makeda. He ruled until 1974. His title included Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah. He was, in his own understanding and in the understanding of millions of his subjects, the heir of a dynasty that began in a tent in the Jerusalem of 3,000 years ago and crossed the Red Sea into Africa. Whether or not you accept the theological claim, the historical depth of it is astonishing, and the chapel stands in Aksum, as it has always stood, and inside it a single man keeps a secret that may be the oldest secret in the world. Fact number 29. In 1988, a researcher named Ron Eglash, a mathematician and computer scientist, traveled across Africa studying the geometric patterns used in traditional African villages, architecture, textiles, and art. What he found changed his understanding of the entire history of mathematics. He found fractals. Fractals are geometric patterns that repeat at different scales, where a small piece of the pattern, enlarged, looks like the whole. They are associated in modern mathematics with the work of Benoit Mandelbrot in the 1970s and 80s, and they are considered a relatively recent mathematical development. Fractal geometry is the mathematics of natural systems, coastlines, clouds, river networks, the branching of trees and lungs and blood vessels. But when Eglash analyzed the layouts of traditional African villages across multiple regions, from the Baal people of Zambia to the Kassina people of Ghana to villages across Mali and Cameroon, he found that they were organized according to fractal principles. The layout of the central family compound was the same shape as the larger village structure. That structure was the same shape as the larger settlement pattern. Each scale of the design reflected the whole. This was not accident. When he spoke with designers, builders, and village elders about their methods, they described deliberate geometric principles that had been passed down and refined over generations. They didn't use the word fractal. That word came from France in 1975. But they were doing fractal geometry. They were organizing space according to self-similar, scale-repeating patterns that mathematicians in Europe were only formally describing centuries later. E. Glass spent years documenting this across the continent and eventually wrote a book called African Fractals, which remains one of the more quietly revolutionary texts in the history of mathematics, because what it demonstrates is that mathematical knowledge is not a single river flowing from one source. It springs from many places in many forms, carried in many kinds of human minds. The fractals of modern computer graphics and the fractals in the layout of an ancient Zambian village are the same mathematical idea. They just develop on opposite sides of the world in different languages for different purposes, and with a separation in time and space that makes the convergence feel, when you let it, like something close to wonder. Fact number 30. When the Portuguese sailor Bartolomé Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa in 1488, the Cape of Good Hope, he did so using navigational knowledge that African and Arab sailors had been applying along those waters for centuries. The Swahili coast, the long eastern coastline of Africa, stretching from Somalia down through Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, had been an active zone of maritime trade since at least the 1st century CE. Arab, Indian, Persian, and Southeast Asian merchants had been sailing these waters, guided by the seasonal monsoon winds, long before any European ship had ventured south of Morocco. And the African city-states along that coast, Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, Zanzibar, Sofala, were not passive recipients of this trade. They were active participants, organizers, sometimes the dominant power in the exchange. Kilwa Kisiwani, on a small island off the coast of what is now Tanzania, was, at its height in the 13th and 14th centuries, one of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan trading cities in the world. Its ruling sultans were wealthy enough to construct a palace, the Husuni Kubwa, that was at the time one of the largest buildings in sub-Saharan Africa. Kilwa minted its own currency, one of the first cities south of the Sahara to do so, and its coins have been found as far away as Australia, carried there by trade networks so far-reaching they become difficult to fully comprehend. When the great Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta visited Kilwa in 1331, he described it as one of the most beautiful cities in the world. He was not a man easily impressed. He had already visited Constantinople, India, and the courts of multiple sultans. He had seen beautiful things, and Kilwa, in his judgment, stood among the finest. The Indian Ocean trade network that ran through these African city-states was a global economy of its time, moving gold, ivory, copper, cloth, porcelain, and spices across thousands of miles of open ocean with a regularity and efficiency that took European maritime powers centuries to match after they arrived. They arrived, in fact, because they were looking for this. They were looking for the trade routes that Arab and African merchants had been using comfortably for well over 1,000 years. They came to find something that had never been lost. They simply hadn't known where to look. 30 facts. And we have moved through mathematics older than civilization, through universities that were teaching when Europe was still fumbling to the dark ages, through a city of mud that stands and breathes and rebuilds itself every year through communal love, through a secret that may be the oldest secret in the world. The thinkers and builders of this continent did not wait for acknowledgement. They did not build their pyramids to impress anyone who might come later and try to take credit. They did not devise their calendars hoping for a mention in someone else's history book. They did it because they were human beings, and human beings build things. They ask questions. They look at the night sky and wonder. They sit beside bones and carve notches into them, counting something, anything, practicing the fundamental human act of trying to make the infinite world make sense. Their legacy is in the stones and the manuscripts and the fractals and the bones. It is in the numbers we count on and the calendar we organize our lives around. It is in the stars that sailors have always used to find their way home. And it is waiting for you in the next part of this story, which reaches further back and further forward than anything we have covered yet. Because we have talked about what Africa built, but we haven't yet talked about what Africa gave to the rest of the world, long before the world ever admitted it was receiving anything at all. Rest easy. The story still has so much room left in it. Chapter 4. The world they built before the world knew. There is a word that gets used a lot when people talk about African history in relation to the rest of the world. The word is influence. Africa influenced ancient Greece. Africa influenced early medicine. Africa influenced mathematics, philosophy, architecture, religion. The word sounds generous when you first hear it, like an acknowledgement, like a credit being given where credit is due. But sit with it a little longer and something starts to feel slightly off, because influence implies a kind of distance. It implies that one thing existed over here and another thing existed over there, and somehow, through contact, through osmosis, through some vague cultural drift, the first thing left a fingerprint on the second. What the evidence actually shows, in case after case after case, is something far more direct than that. It shows teaching. It shows learning. It shows Greek philosophers sitting in Egyptian temples for years at a time, receiving formal instruction from African priests. It shows surgical techniques documented in the Nile Valley appearing, centuries later, in European medical texts with no attribution. It shows architectural principles, astronomical knowledge, and legal frameworks moving from this continent into the bloodstream of what the world would later call Western civilization, and then being quietly credited to everyone except the people who originated them. Tonight, we are going to be more precise than the word influence allows. Fact number 31. Pythagoras, the ancient Greek mathematician whose theorem every school child learns, the one about the square of the hypotenuse, studied in Egypt for 22 years. This is not contested. It is documented in the writings of multiple ancient sources, including the historian Diogenes Laertius and the philosopher Iamblichus. Pythagoras traveled to Egypt around 535 BCE and spent more than 2 decades there, studying under Egyptian priests in the temple complexes of Memphis and Heliopolis. He learned mathematics, astronomy, music theory, and philosophy, and he was not a passive observer. He was a student, enrolled in an institution, receiving structured instruction. The theorem that bears his name, that in a right-angled triangle, the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides, was already known to Egyptian builders centuries before Pythagoras was born. The Rhine mathematical papyrus, which we discussed earlier, demonstrates knowledge of this relationship. Egyptian architects use a rope knotted at precise intervals, 3, 4, and 5 units, to create perfect right angles in their construction work. 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 5 squared is 25. 9 plus 16 is 25. The Pythagorean theorem, in practical application, being used in Egyptian construction sites, in the building of the very monuments that Pythagoras walked past every morning on his way to his lessons. He went home. He taught what he had learned. The world named it after him. This is not unusual. It is a pattern that repeats so consistently through the history of ancient Greek intellectual development that scholars have given it a name. They call it the Egyptian sources question. Thales, considered the first Greek philosopher, also traveled to Egypt. Solon, the Athenian lawmaker, traveled to Egypt. Plato, whose philosophical framework became the foundation of Western thought, traveled to Egypt and spent time studying in the same priestly institutions. When these men returned to Greece and began teaching what they had learned, they often acknowledged their debt to Egyptian wisdom. Plato mentions Egyptian priests multiple times as dialogues with genuine respect, describing them as keepers of knowledge that Greece was still reaching toward. But as the centuries passed and Greek philosophy became Roman philosophy, became European civilization, became the story the world told about itself, the Egyptian chapter got shorter and shorter and eventually, in most popular tellings, disappeared entirely. Fact number 32. The concept of monotheism, the belief in a single all-powerful God, may have its earliest recorded expression not in ancient Israel, but in ancient Egypt, under the pharaoh Akhenaten. Around 1353 BCE, the pharaoh Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, and launched a religious revolution that upended Egyptian society. He declared that there was only one true God, the Aten, represented by the solar disk, and that all other gods would be set aside. He closed temples, redirected resources, and built an entirely new capital city, Amarna, dedicated to his singular deity. This was radical. Egyptian religion had always been polytheistic, a rich, complex ecosystem of gods and their relationships. Akhenaten's break with that tradition was total and deliberate. His hymn to the Aten, a poem of genuine beauty, preserved from that period, describes a God who created all living things, who sustains the world through his warmth, who is present in the cry of the newborn and the flight of every bird. Scholars who compared this hymn to Psalm 104 in the Hebrew Bible have noted the similarities are striking enough to suggest a direct relationship. Akhenaten's revolution did not survive him. After his death, his successors dismantled it, tearing down his monuments, erasing his name from inscriptions, restoring the old gods and the old priesthood. His city was abandoned. His memory was suppressed with such thoroughness that Egyptians of subsequent generations referred to him only as the heretic. But the idea he had articulated, the idea of a single God, universal, without rival, did not disappear. It traveled, in ways historians still debate, into the religious landscape of the ancient Near East. And whether or not you accept any particular theological position, the historical question of where monotheism began leads, again and again, back to the same river valley. Fact number 33. The ancient Egyptians had a concept called Ma'at, usually translated as truth, justice, or cosmic order, that formed the ethical and philosophical foundation of their entire civilization for more than 3,000 years. and its principles bear a relationship to later philosophical traditions that is too close to be entirely coincidental. Ma'at was not simply a rule or a law. It was conceived as a fundamental order of the universe, the balance that kept the stars in their courses, the Nile and its banks, the seasons in their proper sequence. To live in accordance with Ma'at was to live truthfully, justly, generously, to do no harm, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to speak no lies, to weigh your actions against the standard of cosmic balance. When an Egyptian died, their heart was believed to be weighed on a great scale against a feather, the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was light, unburdened by the weight of cruelty and selfishness and deceit, it balanced or outweighed the feather, and the soul passed on to eternal peace. If it was heavy, it was consumed. This is a moral philosophy of remarkable sophistication. The idea that your life's choices accumulate a weight, that this weight is the truest measure of who you are, that the universe itself holds you accountable to a standard of justice. This is not primitive thinking. It is thinking of extraordinary depth, developed and refined across 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization. When Greek philosophers began constructing their ethical frameworks, Plato's theory of forms, Aristotle's concept of virtue, the Stoic idea of living in accordance with nature, they were building in a neighborhood that Egyptian thought had already mapped. The architecture differed, the names changed, but the underlying questions, what is justice? What makes a life good? What does the universe ask of its inhabitants? Have been asked and answered and asked again in Egyptian temples for a very long time before anyone in Athens put the same questions to parchment. Fact number 34. The story of Great Flood, which appears in the Bible as the story of Noah, is found in similar form across dozens of ancient cultures. But one of its earliest recorded versions comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian text. What is less commonly discussed is the way flood mythology permeates ancient African traditions and a sophisticated understanding of hydrology, seasonal flooding, and water management that underlay African civilizations built along great rivers. The annual flooding of the Nile was not a catastrophe to the Egyptians. It was a gift. They called it Ake, the inundation, and it was the first season of their year. The floodwaters deposit a layer of rich, black silt across the land on either side of the river, renewing the soil and making the valley one of the most agriculturally productive places on earth. Egyptian civilization was, in its most fundamental sense, a civilization built on the intelligent management of a flood. Their engineers designed irrigation systems of extraordinary complexity, canal networks, basin systems, and water management structures that channeled and stored floodwater with a precision that allowed farming to extend far beyond the river's immediate banks. They developed the Nilometer, a system of measurement stations positioned along the river to monitor and predict the height of the annual flood weeks or months before it arrived. This was not primitive guesswork. It was early hydraulic engineering, the systematic observation and measurement of a natural system in order to predict and manage its behavior. The knowledge they developed about water, soil, and seasonal cycles fed a civilization for 3,000 years without interruption. It fed a population of several million people in one of the world's most arid environments. And it did so through observation, measurement, engineering, and the careful transmission of technical knowledge from one generation to the next, which is, regardless of what other names you give it, science. Fact number 35. The Dogon people of Mali have been a subject of extraordinary fascination to astronomers and anthropologists since the 1930s, when a French anthropologist named Marcel Griaule spent time living among them and recorded their cosmological knowledge in detail. What he found was remarkable. The Dogon had detailed knowledge of the star Sirius, which they call CG Tolo, and they knew that it has a companion star, invisible to the naked eye, which they call Ptolo. They described the companion as incredibly dense, so dense that a tiny piece of it will be heavier than all the iron in the world. And they said it moved in an elliptical orbit around Sirius with a period of approximately 50 years. Sirius B, the companion star, was not confirmed by Western astronomers until 1862, when it was first observed through a powerful telescope. Its extraordinary density, it is a white dwarf, one of the densest objects in the universe, was not measured until the early 20th century. Its orbital period is approximately 50 years. The Dogon knew this. Somehow, across generations of oral tradition, they had preserved and transmitted precise astronomical information about a star system that requires advanced technology to observe. How they knew it remains genuinely contested. Some researchers have suggested that the knowledge came from contact with Arab astronomers. Some have argued that the extraordinary visual acuity of people living in dark, unpolluted skies, combined with centuries of dedicated observation, may have revealed things that seem impossible until you account for what truly careful, long-term looking can accomplish. Others simply say, "We don't fully know yet," and the honest thing is to say so. But the knowledge was there, in a village in Mali, in the oral traditions of people who lived simply by Western standards but thought with a depth and precision that should not have surprised anyone who was paying attention. There was accurate information about a star system that professional astronomers with telescopes were only beginning to understand. The universe, it seems, is generous with its secrets. It gives them to whoever looks long enough and carefully enough, regardless of what equipment they are using or what language they are asking in. Fact number 36. The transatlantic slave trade, the systematic kidnapping and transportation of millions of African people to the Americas between the 15th and 19th centuries, was not simply a labor system. It was the largest forced transfer of human beings in the history of the world, and it fundamentally shaped every aspect of the modern global economy. Between 12 and 15 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic Ocean in conditions designed to maximize the number of people who survived the crossing while minimizing the cost of doing so, which meant packing human beings into the hold of ships in spaces too small to sit up in, chaining them to prevent movement, feeding them the minimum necessary to keep them alive. An estimated 2 million people died during the crossing itself, the Middle Passage, and were thrown overboard into the ocean. The economies of Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and eventually the United States were built on the labor and the suffering of these millions. The cotton that powered the British Industrial Revolution was picked by enslaved Africans in the American South. The sugar that sweetened European tea was cut by enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. The tobacco, the indigo, the rice, all of it grown by people who received nothing for their work but the continuation of their lives, and sometimes not even that. Economists have calculated, as precisely as historical records allow, that the accumulated unpaid labor of enslaved Africans in America alone, valued at the rates of the time and adjusted for inflation, represents trillions of dollars of wealth that was extracted from black bodies and built into foundations of American prosperity. The universities, the banks, the insurance companies, the ports, the railways. Many of the institutions that form the skeleton of modern American economic life were built with money that had its origins in the slave trade. And yet, here's the fact that is most quietly astonishing. The people who were enslaved did not simply endure. They built under the most violent suppression of human freedom ever systematized into law. They created culture. They created music, the blues and jazz and gospel, and eventually rock and roll and hip-hop. The musical forms that now define global popular culture. They preserve languages. They maintain family bonds across impossible distances. They organize resistance, not just dramatic revolts, but the daily, grinding, dangerous work of stealing literacy, hiding knowledge, building community. The world was given extraordinary things by people from whom the world took everything. That is not a contradiction. That is a testament to something in the human spirit that no system of oppression has ever found a way to fully extinguish. Fact number 37. The African diaspora, the communities of people of African descent scattered across the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe by the slave trade, gave the world a cultural contribution so enormous that it is genuinely difficult to imagine what modern global culture would look like without it. Start with music. Jazz, developed by Black Americans in New Orleans at the turn of the 20th century, is now recognized as one of the most sophisticated musical forms ever created. Its harmonic complexity, its improvisational vocabulary, its rhythmic innovations drew directly on the West African musical traditions that enslaved people had carried across the water, and the only thing the slavers could not take from them, memory. The polyrhythms of West African drumming, the call and response patterns of communal song, the modal scales of grats. All of these survived, transformed, and adapted in the music of the American South. From jazz came rhythm and blues. From rhythm and blues came rock and roll. From rock and roll came pop. From blues came soul. From soul came funk. From funk came hip-hop. From hip-hop came everything currently playing in every corner of the world. The family tree of modern global music has its deepest roots in the musical traditions of West and Central Africa, carried across the ocean by people in chains, and growing ever since in the hands of their descendants. Brazilian capoeira, an acrobatic martial art disguised as dance, developed by enslaved Africans in Brazil who were forbidden from practicing combat arts, is now practiced in gyms on every continent. Caribbean Vodou and Cuban Santeria and Brazilian Candomblé are living religious traditions with millions of practitioners, preserving the theological and ritual frameworks of Yoruba, Fon, and Congo spiritual traditions across 400 years and 4,000 miles of ocean. The hairstyles, the cuisine, the language, whole vocabularies of English slang that are now used globally without anyone knowing their African roots. The storytelling traditions, the quilts, the pottery, the basket weaving techniques that enslaved women in South Carolina maintained for generations using skills from Senegambia. Every single one of these things crossed an ocean in the most terrible of circumstances. Every single one of them survived because the people who carried them decided, against every rational calculation, to hold on. Fact number 38. The Moors, Muslim scholars, scientists, and rulers of North and West African origin governed much of the Iberian Peninsula for nearly 800 years, from 711 CE to 1492 CE. And during that time, They turned the cities of Cordoba, Seville, and Granada into most advanced centers of civilization in Europe. While most of medieval Europe was experiencing the period historians somewhat euphemistically call the Dark Ages, a time of plague, feudal violence, widespread illiteracy, and the near total collapse of urban life. Moorish Cordoba had a population of around 500,000 people. It had 70 libraries. It had 900 public baths. Its streets were paved and lit at night with oil lamps, a luxury that London would not experience for another 700 years. Moorish scholars in Spain translated the works of ancient Greek philosophers, Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes, from Arabic into Latin, making them accessible to European scholars who had lost the Greek language after the fall of Rome. Without these translations, made by African and Arab scholars in Iberian libraries, the Renaissance, which was built substantially on the rediscovery of classical Greek thought, might never have happened, or might have happened much later and differently. Moorish Spain produced Ibn Rushd, known in Europe as Averroes, whose commentaries on Aristotle were so influential that Thomas Aquinas, the foundational philosopher of medieval Catholic theology, referred to him simply as the commentator, as if there were no other commentator worth naming. Moorish Spain produced Al-Zarawi, known in Europe as Albucasis, whose illustrated surgical manual was used in European medical schools for 500 years. It produced Ibn Tufayl, whose philosophical novel about a child raised alone on a desert island directly inspired Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. The intellectual foundations of modern Europe were laid, in significant part, in Moorish libraries by African and Arab scholars working in the cities of Peninsula that the same Europe would later spend 8 centuries trying to reclaim. Fact number 39. Cheikh Anta Diop, a Senegalese physicist, historian, and anthropologist working in the mid-20th century, spent his entire career arguing something that the academic establishment of his time considered deeply controversial. He argued that ancient Egypt was a black African civilization, not a Mediterranean one, not a mixed-race one in some ambiguous, uncommitted sense, but fundamentally originating African, and that its contributions to human knowledge should therefore be understood as African contributions, not as some culturally rootless achievement floating above the continent it was built upon. Diop's methods were rigorous. He analyzed ancient Egyptian skeletal remains, linguistic connections between ancient Egyptian and other African languages, cultural continuities between pharaonic Egypt and sub-Saharan African traditions, and, significantly, ancient Egyptian descriptions and depictions of themselves. He performed melanin dosage tests on mummified skin tissue. He documented the linguistic relationship between ancient Egyptian and the Wolof language of his native Senegal. He traced the cultural and religious connections between Egyptian practices and those of other African societies across the continent. The academic response to his work was initially hostile. His doctoral thesis was rejected multiple times before finally being accepted in Paris in 1954. European and American Egyptologists spent decades dismissing, marginalizing, and attempting to refute his conclusions, sometimes with genuine scholarly rigor, sometimes with what looked, in retrospect, more like institution discomfort than intellectual disagreement. But the conversation he started never stopped. His work influenced an entire generation of African and African American scholars. It gave millions of people a framework for understanding their own historical relationship to one of the world's greatest civilizations. And as genetics, archaeology, and linguistics have continued to develop in the decades since his death in 1986, the general direction of evidence has consistently moved toward, not away from, the conclusions he drew. He was not infallible. No scholar is. But he asked the right questions at a time when the academic world was deeply invested in not asking them. And the asking mattered as much as the answers. Fact number 40. In 2019, archaeologists excavating a site in Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa announced the discovery of what is now considered the earliest known drawing made by a human being. It is a crosshatch pattern, 9 lines crossing 6 others, drawn in red ochre on a small flake of silcrete stone. It has been dated to approximately 73,000 years ago. 73,000 years. This small, red, carefully made pattern was drawn by a human hand in a cave on the southern tip of Africa approximately 33,000 years before the famous cave paintings of Lascaux in France, the ones that appear in every art history textbook as the beginning of human visual expression. The paintings at Lascaux are magnificent. They are worthy of every bit of wonder they have received. But they are not the beginning. The beginning was in Africa, on a flake of stone the size of your palm. In 9 lines crossing 6 others, drawn by someone who had a reason, whose mind was organized enough, sophisticated enough, intentional enough to make a mark and wanted to stay. We do not know what it meant. We do not know if it was art in the sense we use that word, an expression of beauty or meaning or inner life. It may have been a record, a symbol, a pattern with practical significance. It may have been something a child made while waiting for the rain to stop. We will never know. And there is something both humbling and beautiful about that not knowing. What we know is that this is the first mark, the first record of a human being deciding that something in their mind was worth preserving outside of it. The first step in a long, extraordinary journey that goes from a cave on the African coast to every book ever written and every song ever recorded and every conversation we have ever had across all the millennia between that moment and this one. It begins here. Everything begins here. 40 facts. And the picture we have assembled together across these 4 chapters is nothing less than a complete reimagining of where the world came from. The mathematics that structures modern science, older than Greece, born in Africa. The calendar that organizes every human life on Earth, developed along the Nile. The first university in the world, built by an African woman. The music that defines global culture, carried across an ocean by enslaved Africans and grown into something that changed every human heart it touched. The first mark ever made by human hands, a red crosshatch in a cave on the southern coast of a continent that the world spent centuries calling dark. There is nothing dark about it. There never was. There is one more chapter waiting for us, and it may be the most important one yet, because it is not just about what happened. It is about what is still happening, about the facts that feel the most forbidden, not because they're the most ancient, but because they're the most recent, the most raw, the most directly connected to the world you are living in right now. Tonight, in whatever quiet corner of this earth you have found yourself, let your body rest. Let the weight of all these names and dates and cities and discoveries settle into you like something nourishing, like something your bones have been waiting a long time to receive. Because we are almost home. And the last part of the story is the one that belongs most directly to you. Chapter 5. What they never wanted you to remember. There's a reason this chapter comes last. Not because what it contains is less important than what came before. Not because the facts here are smaller or quieter or easier to absorb. It comes last because the things that are hardest to hear, the things that sit closest to the present moment, that touch the world we are actually living in right now, need to be received with a full heart. They need the weight of everything that came before them. They need the kingdoms and the warriors and the scholars and the builders standing behind them, lending them the full, luminous context without which they are only pain. With that context, they become something different. They become clarity. They become the final piece of a picture that, once you have seen a whole, you cannot unsee. And the inability to unsee it is not a burden. It is a gift. It is a particular gift that truth is always given to people who are willing to receive it. The gift of knowing where you actually are, which is the only way to ever figure out where you are going. So breathe, settle, and let us finish this together. Fact number 41. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, a meeting of 14 European nations held in the German capital, divided the entire continent of Africa among European powers without a single African representative present in the room. 14 nations, several months of negotiation, thousands of miles of African land, drawn into new borders on European maps by men who had, in many cases, never visited the territories they were claiming. The conference was convened by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and attended by representatives of Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Denmark, the Ottoman Empire, the United States, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Sweden, and the newly unified German state. Africa itself sent no one, because the premise of the conference was that Africa had no one worth consulting. The borders drawn at that conference, sometimes called a scramble for Africa, cut straight through existing kingdoms, tribal territories, linguistic communities, and family networks with the casual indifference of men drawing lines on a map in a warm room very far from the consequences of their pencils. The Malinke and the Mande were split between French and British territories. The Somali people were divided among British, Italian, and French colonial zones. The Yoruba, the Igbo, the Hausa, all compressed into a single British protectorate that would eventually become Nigeria, a country whose internal tensions, more than a century later, still reflect the violence of that original compression. The borders drawn in Berlin are, with very few exceptions, the borders of Africa today. The conflicts that have defined the post-colonial African political landscape, from a Nigerian civil war to Rwandan genocide to the decades of instability in the Democratic Republic of Congo, cannot be fully understood without understanding that the nations these conflicts tore apart were not nations in any organic sense. They were territories invented by Europeans in a single winter in Berlin, with no regard for who was actually living inside them or what their relationships with their neighbors had always been. This is not ancient history. The youngest grandmother alive today was born after those borders were drawn. Their consequences are living and breathing in the present tense. And they're one of the most direct and traceable lines between deliberate historical decision and current human suffering anywhere on Earth. Fact number 42. King Leopold II of Belgium, who is still memorialized in statues and street names across Belgium, personally owned the Congo Free State from 1885 to 1908 as a private property, not as a colonial territory of the Belgian state. as his personal possession. And what he did there was, by the assessment of multiple historians, one of the largest atrocities of the modern era. Leopold had presented himself to the international community as a humanitarian, a man bringing civilization and Christianity to the Dark Continent, a man whose personal involvement in Central Africa was an act of charity toward people he described as in need of guidance. The reality was the systematic extraction of rubber and ivory through a system of terror so comprehensive and so deliberately designed that it reduced the population of the Congo by an estimated 10 million people in approximately 20 years. Workers were given rubber quotas they were required to meet. If they failed to meet them, their hands were cut off, sometimes the hands of their wives or children, as punishment and as proof to overseers that bullets had been used for compliance rather than wasted. Baskets of severed hands became a currency in Leopold's Congo, proof of enforcement, traded between soldiers and administrators with bureaucratic normalcy that is among the most disturbing aspects of the entire system. The journalist Edie Morel, a British shipping clerk who noticed that ships leaving for the Congo were full of weapons and returning full of rubber, with no trade goods going the other way, which meant the rubber was not being traded but extracted by force, blew the operation open. The British consul Roger Casement documented the atrocities in horrifying detail in a report submitted to the British government in 1904. The international pressure that followed eventually forced Leopold to hand the Congo over to the Belgian state in 1908. Leopold died in 1909. He died one of the wealthiest men in Europe. He built palaces and public parks and monuments with the money extracted from the Congo. Some of those buildings are still standing in Brussels, still beautiful, still visited by tourists who may not know what they were built from. The Congo, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, is one of the most resource-rich nations on Earth, containing deposits of cobalt, coltan, diamonds, gold, and timber of almost incomprehensible value. It has been politically unstable and economically exploited in various forms since independence in 1960. The roots of that instability run directly back through Belgian colonial rule to the 20 years when a single European king used an entire country as his personal rubber plantation. The coltan in your smartphone, a mineral essential to the rechargeable batteries that power every device in the modern world. A significant portion of it comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The connection between Leopold's Congo and the phone in your hand is longer and more direct than most people realize, and asks uncomfortable questions that do not have comfortable answers. Fact number 43. The Maafa, a Swahili and Bantu word meaning great disaster or terrible occurrence, is a term used by many African and African American scholars to describe the full continuum of suffering inflicted on African people across the centuries of the slave trade, colonialism, and their aftermath. And one of its least discussed dimensions is what it did to African economic development. In 2010, an economist named Nathan Nunn published research demonstrating a statistically measurable relationship between the intensity of the slave trade, in particular African regions, and the poverty of those same regions today. The areas from which the most people were enslaved, which correspond broadly to the most economically depressed regions of contemporary Africa, are not poor because of some inherent deficit. They are poor because the slave trade systematically removed their most productive people, destabilized their political systems, incentivize intercommunity raiding and betrayal, and dismantle the social trust on which economic development depends. The colonial period then compounded this. Colonial economic systems were designed not to develop African economies, but to extract resources from them. Infrastructure was built to move resources out, roads and railways running from mines and plantations to ports, not between cities. African manufacturing was actively suppressed to ensure that African markets remained consumers of European goods. Education was designed to produce low-level administrators for the colonial system, not engineers, economists, or political leaders. When independence came for most of sub-Saharan Africa in the 1960s, the new nations inherited borders drawn by others, institutions designed to serve someone else's interests, debts owed to former colonizers, an economy structured around raw material export rather than internal development. The leaders who tried to change this, Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, were removed, often violently, often with the assistance of the same Western powers whose economic interests their reforms would have threatened. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary president of Burkina Faso, who ruled from 1983 to 1987, is worth pausing on. In 4 years, he vaccinated 2.5 million children against meningitis, yellow fever, and measles in a single week. He planted 10 million trees to combat desertification. He launched a nationwide literacy campaign that dramatically increased the percentage of Burkinabe people who could read. He refused to use air conditioning in his office because ordinary citizens didn't have it. He drove himself to work in a Renault 5, the cheapest car available, rather than the luxury vehicles typically associated with heads of state. He was assassinated in 1987. His successor, Blaise Compaoré, who ruled Burkina Faso for the next 27 years, had the backing of France and the Ivory Coast. Sankara's body was dismembered and buried in an unmarked grave to prevent his tomb from becoming a place of pilgrimage. His name became one anyway. Fact number 44. Africa is, by virtually every geological and biological measure, the wealthiest continent on Earth in terms of natural resources. And it is, by the same measures, the continent where those resources have most consistently failed to benefit the people who live above them. The Democratic Republic of Congo alone contains an estimated $24 trillion worth of untapped mineral deposits: cobalt, coltan, gold, diamonds, uranium. The uranium used in the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki came from a mine in the Katanga region of Congo. South Africa holds the largest known deposits of platinum on Earth. Nigeria sits on oil reserves that have generated more than $600 billion in revenue since the 1950s, and yet 60% of its population lives in poverty. This is not a paradox of nature. It is a predictable outcome of a system. The system, sometimes called the resource curse, sometimes called neocolonialism, depending on who is describing it and from what angle, works roughly like this. A country has valuable resources. Foreign companies, backed by the governments and financial institutions of wealthy nations, establish relationships with local elites who grant them extraction rights in exchange for personal wealth. The profits flow outward. The environmental damage stays. The local population receives minimal tax revenue because the contracts were written to minimize it. When leaders arise who want to renegotiate those contracts in their people's favor, they face economic pressure, political destabilization, and occasionally, as the history of this continent demonstrates with devastating regularity, something worse. The wealth is real. The people are real. The gap between them is not an accident of geography or culture, or anything inherent to the land or its people. It is a gap that was constructed carefully and deliberately over centuries and is maintained today through financial systems, trade agreements, and political relationships that are rarely described for what they actually are. Fact number 45. Africa is home to the fastest growing youth population on Earth. By 2050, 1 in 4 human beings alive will be African. By the end of this century, Africa's population is projected to reach 4 billion, meaning the continent will hold roughly a third of all humanity. This is one of the most significant demographic facts of the 21st century, and it receives a fraction of the attention it deserves. These young people are not a problem to be managed. They are a force. A generation of Africans are growing up with access to mobile technology that has bypassed the infrastructure gaps of the 20th century. Africa's mobile banking revolution has brought financial services to hundreds of millions of people who never had bank accounts, transforming how rural economies function with a speed that has astonished economists. Entrepreneurs in Lagos and Nairobi and Accra and Kigali are building technology companies, fashion brands, film industries, music empires. Afrobeats has become one of the dominant sounds of global popular music in the last decade, not because it was pushed by a major Western label, but because young Nigerians and Ghanaians made something so alive and so irresistible that the world simply could not keep it out. Nollywood, Nigeria's film industry, is the second largest film industry in the world by volume of output. It produces more films per year than Hollywood. Most of them are made on tiny budgets with minimal equipment and distributed through informal networks that reach every corner of the continent and its diaspora. They are watched by hundreds of millions of people who have never been adequately served by the cinemas of the Western world, because they tell stories about people who look like them, living in worlds they recognize, feeling things they know. The demographic future of this planet is African. The cultural energy of this planet is increasingly African. And the question that the 21st century is genuinely going to have to answer, not in rhetoric, but in policy, in trade, in political relationship, is whether the world is finally willing to engage with Africa as what has always been, a civilization, not a charity case, a partner, not a project, a source, not a periphery. Fact number 46. The African Union, established in 2002 as a successor to the Organization of African Unity, is often described in Western media as a weak, ineffective institution. What is less often noted is that it was established on the explicit model of the European Union, with the explicit goal of African political and economic integration, and that the obstacles it faces were deliberately built into the African political landscape by the same colonial powers whose own integration is considered a model of international cooperation. The vision of Pan-African unity, the idea that Africa's strength lies in the solidarity of its people across national borders, was not invented by the African Union. It was articulated by Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of independent Ghana in the 1950s and 60s. It was dreamed by Marcus Garvey in the early 20th century from his base in Jamaica and New York. It was felt in the bones by everyone who ever looked at the borders drawn at the Berlin Conference and understood that they were designed to divide. The dream of a United States of Africa, a single political entity representing the interests of 1.5 billion people, remains unrealized, but it has never been abandoned. It lives in the poetry of African writers and the speeches of African leaders and the quiet conviction of ordinary people across this continent who know, without needing to be told, that the things that divide them were mostly put there by someone else and mostly serve someone else's interests. Whether that dream becomes something concrete in the 21st century is one of the genuinely open questions of our time. The answer will shape the lives of billions of people, and it will be decided not by outsiders, but by Africans themselves, which is, in the end, the way it should always have been. Fact number 47. The oldest love poem ever found was written in ancient Egypt. It was discovered on a papyrus dating to approximately 1300 BC, over 3,000 years ago. It is a collection of love songs, written from the perspective of both a young man and a young woman, and it describes the experience of being in love with a directness, a tenderness, and a humor that feels startlingly contemporary. The poems speak of a young woman describing how her heart races when she sees her beloved coming. They speak of a young man comparing his love to a lotus flower, fragrant, beautiful, essential. They speak of longing and sleeplessness, and particular agony of seeing someone you love from a distance, and not being able to cross that distance immediately. 3,000 years ago, in the Nile Valley, a human being sat down and tried to put into words what it felt like to be in love. And they succeeded well enough that we can read those words today and recognize in them something we have felt ourselves, something we felt last week, something some of us are feeling right now. This is a fact that undoes me most quietly. Not the pyramids, not the mathematics, not the empires or the battles or the libraries. This, the oldest love poem on earth, written in Africa 3,000 years ago by someone sitting with the same ache in their chest that every human being who has ever fallen in love has carried. There is no distance between that person and us. There is time, enormous amounts of it, but no distance. We are the same creature, shaped by the same needs, reaching for the same things, finding comfort in the same words. Africa did not give the world only monuments and mathematics. It gave the world the first recorded attempt to say, I love you, and I want you to know. Fact number 48. The word Ubuntu, from the Zulu and Xhosa languages of Southern Africa, is usually translated into English as I am because we are, but that translation, accurate as far as it goes, doesn't fully capture what the word contains. Ubuntu is a philosophy, a complete ethical framework. It describes a way of understanding what a person is, not as an isolated individual, a self-contained unit of needs and desires moving through the world in competition with other isolated units, but as a being whose identity is fundamentally constituted by their relationships. You are not a person, and then you have community. You are a person because of community. Your humanity is not something you possess individually. It is something that is given to you and renewed in you by the people around you, and something you give others in return. This philosophy shaped the way communities were organized, the way conflict were resolved, the way resources were shared, the way elders were treated, the the way children were raised across wide swathes of southern and eastern Africa. It was the philosophical water in which whole civilizations swam. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the South African theologian and anti-apartheid activist who spent his life working for reconciliation in one of the most divided societies on earth, described Ubuntu as the foundation of his entire approach to justice. He said a person with Ubuntu is open, generous, not threatened by others' goodness, secure in themselves because they know they belong to a greater whole. When Nelson Mandela walked out of prison after 27 years and chose reconciliation over revenge, Ubuntu was one of the words people reached for to explain it, because it described a way of being human that the Western political tradition, with its frameworks of individual rights and adversarial justice, did not have quite the same vocabulary for. The world is slowly learning this word, slowly understanding what it contains. And in the learning, something is being offered, the possibility of a different way of thinking about what we owe each other, what community means, what it looks like to be genuinely, fully human. This is a gift from Africa to the world, one that the world is still slowly unwrapping. Fact number 49. The story of Africa is still being written. This is not a platitude. It is the most concrete, most factual, most urgently true statement in this entire script. Because the history we have moved through tonight, the kingdoms and the scholars and the warriors and the mathematicians and the griots and the lovers and the resistors, all that history is not behind us. It is underneath us. It is the ground on which something living and extraordinary is currently growing. Right now, tonight, as you listen to this, there are archaeologists in Sudan carefully excavating Nubian pyramids that have never been fully studied. There are scholars in Timbuktu digitizing manuscripts that have waited 600 years to be read by anyone outside the families that preserved them. There are geneticists in Lagos and Nairobi and Cape Town mapping the full complexity of African human genetic diversity, a diversity so vast that, as one researcher put it, there is more genetic variation within the continent of Africa than between all other continents combined, because this is where our species began, and this is where it has had the longest time become the many extraordinary things it is. There are novelists in Lagos and Nairobi and Accra writing books that are changing what literature is and can be. There are musicians in Dakar and Johannesburg and Addis Ababa making sounds that have never existed before. There are engineers and entrepreneurs in Kigali and Accra building technology companies that are solving problems unique to the African context in ways that have no precedent anywhere else on earth. There are grandmothers in villages from Senegal to Zimbabwe and from Ethiopia to Mozambique sitting with their grandchildren right now. In the evening, as the light changes and the air cools, telling them the stories of who they come from, speaking names into small, attentive ears, making sure that the chain of knowing, the long, unbroken thread of memory that connects every African alive today to every ancestor who ever built or fought or loved or wondered, does not snap. This is the oldest and most important technology on Earth. This is what griots do. This is what this channel is for. And tonight, you have been part of it. Listening in the dark, receiving something that was meant for you, that has been waiting for someone exactly like you to be ready to hear it. Fact number 50. You already knew, somewhere deep in you, that this story was bigger than the version you were given. That is why you are here. No one watches a 3-hour video about African history in the dark, late at night, settling in for something they don't actually care about. You are here because something in you has always understood that the world is larger and more luminous and more complex than the narrow slice of it you were taught. You are here because the absence of this history in the places where it should have been present, in school, in textbooks, in the mainstream stories the culture tells about itself, create a hunger you have been trying to satisfy for a long time. The 50th fact is this: the truth was never completely hidden. It survived. It survived in the pyramids and the manuscripts and the oral traditions and the songs and the stories and the love poems and philosophy and the fractals carved into village layouts and the astronomical knowledge preserved in the memory of people who never needed a telescope to see what was actually there. It survived because something in human beings always fights for what is real. Something in us refuses a smaller story when we can sense that a larger one exists. Something in us reaches toward the fire even when we can't see it, because the warmth is unmistakable, and warmth in this world is never nothing. Africa's story is the world's story. It is the oldest story. It begins before writing, before cities, before any of the categories we use to organize history were even imaginable, in a cave on the southern coast of the continent, where someone picked up a piece of ochre and pressed a mark into stone and said, in the only language they had, "I was here. I thought something. I felt something. And I wanted it to last." It lasted. Here it is. After 73,000 years, after empires and disasters and libraries burned and manuscripts hidden and languages silenced, and people shipped across oceans, and wars fought and names erased, and truth buried under mountains of deliberate forgetting, here it is, still here, still speaking, still reaching across whatever distance exists between the one who tells and the one who listens, still asking to be received. You received it tonight. Take a slow breath. Feel the weight of your body wherever you are lying or sitting or resting. Feel the quiet of the room around you and the darkness outside it. The same darkness that has been above this earth for every single one of thousands of years we have traveled through together tonight. Think of Amon-Irenas, standing somewhere in the Nile Valley, with one eye and a negotiating table and an empire she refused to give. Think of Sundiata pulling himself to his feet in some direction the story has never quite agreed on, and deciding that standing was possible after all. Think of Fatima Alfieri, emptying her inheritance into the foundation of a library that would outlast every king who ever tried to tell her what a woman was allowed to build. Think of the person in the cave on the African coast, 73,000 years ago, holding a piece of red ochre, making a mark. You are connected to every single one of them. The thread is long. It is older than any nation or any language or any religion or any border drawn on any map in any room in any century. It runs through the ground of this entire planet, through the very substance of what it means to be human, from that cave on the southern coast all the way to wherever you are right now, breathing in the dark, listening to the story that has always been yours. Sleep well. You know where you come from now. And knowing where you come from is how you know, quietly, certainly, in the deepest part of yourself, exactly how far you are capable of going. Good night.